The sound of designer heels clicking across Italian marble echoed through the Morrison mansion's grand foyer. Catherine Morrison paused at the top of the sweeping staircase, her hand instinctively moving to her 6-month pregnant belly as she heard footsteps behind her. "Catherine! Wait!" called a voice that made her stomach clench with dread. She turned to see Sophia Brennan approaching, her 28-year-old face wearing that same false smile that had fooled everyone else but not Catherine. Not anymore. "What are you doing in my home? Sophia?" Catherine's voice was measured, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Sophia's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, didn't Richard tell you he gave me a key months ago? Said I should feel welcome here." She stepped closer, and Catherine caught the scent of the expensive perfume her millionaire husband had been buying for someone else. "Richard isn't here," Catherine said carefully, taking a step back toward the stairs. At 47, she had learned to read danger in a young woman's eyes, and what she saw in Sophia's made her blood run cold. "I know exactly where Richard is," Sophia said, her voice dropping its fake sweetness. "He's at the office, probably thinking about how much easier his life would be without certain complications." Catherine's hand tightened on the mahogany banister. "If you have something to say, say it. I'm saying that baby you're carrying, it's ruining everything." Sophia's mask finally slipped completely. "Richard and I have plans, and they don't include playing house with his middle-aged wife and another brat." The words hit Catherine like physical blows. She had suspected Richard's latest affair, had even hired a private investigator to confirm it. But hearing this level of calculation from the woman he had chosen over their 20-year marriage was devastating. "Get out of my house," Catherine said, turning toward the stairs. "Our house? You mean?" Sophia called after her. "Richard's already putting it in my name. Did he mention that in your little heart-to-heart conversations about your precious pregnancy?" Catherine froze on the second step. "That's impossible. This house is in both our names." "Was in both your names," Sophia corrected, moving closer. "Amazing what a wife's signature looks like when someone practices it enough times." The implication hit Catherine like a sledgehammer. Forgery, identity theft. How long had Richard been planning this? "You're lying," Catherine said, but her voice shook. "Am I?" Sophia was directly behind her now. "Check your bank accounts lately, your investment portfolios. Or have you been too busy playing perfect wife to notice your millionaire husband moving millions into offshore accounts?" Catherine gripped the banister harder, her knuckles white. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. I'm having this baby, and Richard is the father. Not if you're not around to have it." The words were spoken so quietly that Catherine almost didn't hear them. She turned, and in that moment of shifting balance, Sophia's hands shot out and connected hard with Catherine's shoulders. The world tilted. Catherine felt herself falling backward, her hands grasping at empty air as gravity took hold. The marble steps rushed up to meet her, each impact sending jolts of agony through her body. She heard her own voice screaming, heard the sickening sounds of her body hitting stone, felt the terrifying loosening sensation in her belly that every pregnant woman fears. When the world finally stopped spinning, Catherine lay crumpled at the bottom of the staircase she had walked up and down thousands of times in 20 years of marriage. Above her, Sophia's voice called out with theatrical concern. "Catherine, are you all right down there? Oh my goodness, you took such a terrible fall." Catherine tried to speak, but only a groan escaped her lips. The pain in her abdomen was overwhelming, and she could feel warmth spreading between her legs. Her baby, her precious baby. "I need help," she whispered. "Don't worry," Sophia called sweetly. "I'm calling Richard right now. He'll know exactly what to do." Through her haze of pain, Catherine heard Sophia's phone conversation with crystal clarity. "Richard, there's been an accident." Catherine fell down the stairs. "Yes, I was here visiting, just like you suggested." "No. No one else saw anything. She just lost her balance." Lost her balance. Catherine closed her eyes, understanding with horrible clarity that this was no accident. This was attempted murder, and her millionaire husband was part of it. The front door burst open, and Richard Morrison's voice filled the foyer with its familiar authority. "What happened here?" he demanded. But Catherine heard something else in his tone, not surprise, but confirmation that a plan had worked. "She just fell," Sophia said, and Catherine could hear the tears in the younger woman's voice. Academy Award-level performance. "I tried to catch her, but she was too far ahead of me on the stairs." Richard knelt beside Catherine, his face a mask of concern that didn't reach his eyes. "Catherine, can you hear me? Don't try to move." "Richard," Catherine managed to whisper. "She pushed me. Sophia pushed me." His expression didn't change, but his eyes grew cold. "You're confused, darling. Sophia would never hurt you. You must have tripped." "No," Catherine said more forcefully, ignoring the shooting pains. She admitted everything. The house papers, the bank accounts, the planning. "Catherine, you're delirious." Richard interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Sophia came by to bring you flowers. Remember, you invited her in, and then you lost your balance on the stairs. Pregnancy can affect equilibrium." The lies rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Catherine realized this conversation had been rehearsed. Her husband of 20 years, the father of her unborn child, was gaslighting her even as she lay bleeding on their marble floor. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. "The ambulance is almost here," Richard said, squeezing her hand. "Everything's going to be fine." But as Catherine looked into his eyes, she knew nothing would ever be fine again. The man she had trusted with her life, her love, and her future had just watched another woman try to murder her and their child. As the paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher, Catherine made a silent promise to herself and her unborn baby. If they survived this, she would make sure the truth came out. Her millionaire husband might think his money and influence could bury what had happened here, but Catherine Morrison was done being the weak wife who stayed silent. This was war. 3 hours later, in the sterile brightness of Mercy General Hospital, Catherine lay connected to monitors that beeped reassurance about her baby's heartbeat. The emergency room doctor had delivered the news she desperately needed to hear: both mother and baby were stable. But as morphine dulled the physical pain, the emotional agony sharpened to a razor's edge. Her mind drifted back to how it all began. 23 years ago, when she was a 24-year-old marketing coordinator, and Richard Morrison was the 31-year-old real estate developer who walked into her office like he owned the world. "Catherine Rodriguez," he had said, reading her nameplate with that devastating smile. "Beautiful name for a beautiful woman." She should have known then. Men who opened with lines like that usually had plenty of practice, but Richard had been persistent, charming, and most importantly, he had made her feel special. Within 6 months, he was telling her about his dreams of building a real estate empire, about wanting a partner who could help him reach the top of Denver's competitive market. "I don't just want a wife," he had said during his proposal at the city's most expensive restaurant. "I want a teammate, someone who believes in me as much as I believe in us." The wedding bells had rung at St. Catherine's Cathedral 2 years later, with 300 guests celebrating the union of Denver's most promising young developer and his radiant bride. Catherine had worn her grandmother's pearls and truly believed she was the luckiest woman alive. The early years had been intoxicating. Richard's Morrison Development Group grew from a small operation to one of Colorado's most successful firms. Catherine had used her marketing background to help brand the company, design their materials, even negotiate some of the early deals. She had been his true partner in every sense, but success, she learned, was a double-edged sword. The first affair happened during their 5th year of marriage. Catherine discovered it through credit card statements, romantic dinners at restaurants where she had never been, hotel charges in cities where Richard claimed to be attending business conferences alone. When she confronted him, Richard had broken down in tears. "Catherine, I'm so sorry. It meant nothing. You know you're the only woman I really love. She was just available when I was lonely on the road. It will never happen again." And Catherine, who was 29 and still believed that marriages could survive anything, with enough love and forgiveness, had believed him. The second affair happened 3 years later. This time Richard was more careful with the financial evidence. But Catherine's sister Maria had seen him with a blonde woman at a restaurant across town. "Catherine, honey, I hate to tell you this," Maria had said during one of their weekly coffee dates. "But I saw Richard last Tuesday night at Chez Laurent. He was with a woman who definitely wasn't you." "Are you sure it was him?" Catherine had asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "Positive. And Kat, they weren't discussing business. He was holding her hand across the table." That confrontation had been uglier. Richard had accused Maria of trying to break up their marriage out of jealousy, had claimed the woman was a client who was going through a difficult divorce and needed emotional support. "You're being paranoid, Catherine," he had said. "My success is making you suspicious of normal business relationships. Do you want me to stop helping clients just because some of them happen to be attractive women?" By their 10th anniversary, Catherine had stopped looking for evidence. It was easier to ignore the signs than to face the reality that her husband viewed their marriage vows as suggestions rather than commitments. The pattern was always the same. Richard would disappear into an affair for months, become distant and critical at home, then eventually either get bored or get caught and return with expensive gifts and promises to change. "I'm going through a midlife crisis," he had explained after affair number 4. "But I realize now that everything I need is right here with you. You're the foundation of everything I've built." Catherine had wanted children from the beginning, but Richard always had reasons to wait. First, the business needed to be more established. Then they needed to buy a bigger house. Then Richard needed to secure some major deals to ensure their financial future. By the time Catherine turned 40, her biological clock was screaming. She had given Richard an ultimatum: start trying for a baby now, or she was filing for divorce. "You're right," Richard had said, taking her in his arms. "I've been selfish. Let's have a family." But 2 years of trying had yielded nothing but disappointment and increasingly expensive fertility treatments. Catherine had begun to accept that motherhood might not be in her future when, at 46, she finally conceived naturally. The pregnancy had been a miracle, a gift she had never expected to receive. Richard had seemed genuinely excited, talking about converting his home office into a nursery, about teaching their child to ski in Aspen and sail on the lake. But Catherine now realized that somewhere during those conversations about their future, Richard had been making very different plans. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Just heard about your fall. Coming to hospital now. Love you." 20 minutes later, Maria Rodriguez Santos burst through the hospital room door like a protective tornado. At 45, Catherine's younger sister had the same dark eyes and stubborn chin, but where Catherine had learned to smooth her edges for Richard's comfort, Maria had kept all her sharp corners intact. "What the hell happened?" "Cat," Maria demanded, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "And don't give me some story about losing your balance. You've never been clumsy a day in your life." Catherine looked at her sister, the same woman who had tried to warn her about Richard's affairs, who had questioned his treatment of her for years, who had never bought into the perfect marriage facade. "Richard's having another affair," Catherine said quietly. "I know that much," Maria replied. "I've been waiting for you to figure it out. This Sophia girl isn't exactly discreet. She's been posting photos of expensive gifts on social media for months. But what does that have to do with you falling downstairs?" Catherine took a deep breath. "She didn't just want Richard to herself, Maria. She wanted me gone. Permanently." Maria's face went white. "Catherine, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Sophia Brennan pushed me down those stairs hoping I would lose the baby. Maybe hoping I would lose more than that. That's attempted murder." "I know. And Richard," Catherine's voice broke slightly, "he knew. Maria. When I told him what really happened, he looked me in the eyes and told me I was confused. He's covering for her." Maria sat back in her chair, her expression cycling through shock, anger, and finally in grim determination. 20 years, she said finally. 20 years I've watched that man chip away at your confidence, your independence, your sense of reality. And now he's graduated to letting his girlfriend try to kill you. I don't know what to do, Catherine admitted. Even if I can prove what happened, Richard has money, influence, connections. He'll find a way to make this disappear. Not if we're smart about it, Maria said firmly. Kat, remember what happened to our cousin Elena when she tried to divorce that abusive husband of hers? She documented everything, built a case, and took him for everything he was worth. Elena's ex-husband wasn't a millionaire with half the city council in his pocket. No, but he was a controlling narcissist who thought his wife was too stupid to fight back. Sound familiar? Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a spark of her old fire. The determination that had helped her build Richard's business in the early days before he had trained her to step back and let him take credit. What are you thinking? She asked. I'm thinking that Richard Morrison has finally gone too far, and it's time to show him what happens when he underestimates a woman who's done playing by his rules. A knock on the door interrupted them. A woman in her late 30s stepped in, wearing a badge and a serious expression. Mrs. Morrison, I'm Detective Rebecca Park with the Denver Police Department. I'd like to ask you some questions about your accident this afternoon. Catherine looked at Maria, who nodded encouragingly. It wasn't an accident, Detective, Catherine said, her voice growing stronger with each word. It was attempted murder. As Catherine began to tell her story, she realized that the ending of her 20-year marriage might actually be the beginning of something much more important, the fight for her life, her child's future, and her own truth. The foundation of lies Richard had built was about to crumble, and Catherine Morrison was going to make sure she was the one holding the sledgehammer. Meanwhile, across town in the glass tower that housed Morrison Development Group, Richard Morrison stood at his office window overlooking downtown Denver, his phone pressed to his ear. The city stretched out below him like a kingdom he had conquered through 25 years of ruthless ambition, but today his empire felt precarious. This complicates things. Sophia, he said, his voice stripped of the warmth he had shown Catherine's sister at the hospital. On the other end of the line, Sophia Brennan's voice was tight with panic. She was supposed to lose the baby. Richard, that was the whole point. A fall like that should have caused a miscarriage. Richard closed his eyes, massaging his temples where a headache was building. Keep your voice down. Are you at your apartment? Yes, but I can't stop shaking. What if she remembers what I said to her? What if she tells someone about the house papers and the bank accounts? She won't, Richard said with more confidence than he felt. Catherine's been playing the perfect wife for so long. She doesn't even remember how to fight back. Besides, who's going to believe her word against ours? But what if? Listen to me carefully, Sophia. Richard interrupted, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had intimidated business rivals for decades. We stick to the story. You came to visit Catherine because you wanted to make peace about our relationship. She invited you in, showed you around the house, and lost her balance on the stairs. You tried to help but couldn't reach her in time. End of story. Sophia's breathing was audible through the phone. The detective who called me wants to interview me tomorrow morning. Perfect. Give her the performance of your life. Tears, guilt about not being able to prevent the fall, concern for Catherine and the baby. Can you handle that? I think so. You'd better do more than think so, Richard said coldly. Because if this goes sideways, you're the one who's going to prison for assault. I was nowhere near that house. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make Richard nervous. Sophia, are you there? I'm here, she said finally, but her voice had changed. I'm just wondering why you're talking about me going to prison when this was your idea. Richard felt the first flutter of real concern. Sophia had always been manipulable, desperate for his approval and the lifestyle he could provide. But cornered animals sometimes bit back. It wasn't my idea for you to push her down the stairs, he said carefully. I told you we needed to find a way to make Catherine's pregnancy problematic. I never said anything about physical violence. You said the problem would take care of itself if she lost the baby. Sophia shot back. You said it would just be her word against ours after that. What did you think I was going to do? Convince her to trip? Richard realized with dawning horror that Sophia had recorded their conversation. The tremor in her voice wasn't just panic, it was the sound of someone who had finally realized she was expendable. Are you recording this call? Sophia, would it matter if I was? It would matter to both of us, Richard said smoothly, shifting into damage control mode. Look, we're both upset and saying things we don't mean. The important thing is that we support each other through this investigation. Catherine is going to be fine. The baby's going to be fine. And in a few months, this will all be forgotten. And then what, you divorce Catherine and marry me like you promised? Richard looked out at his city again, calculating odds and exit strategies. Of course, sweetheart. That's always been the plan. But as he spoke the words, Richard was already mentally drafting the goodbye email he would send from his apartment in the Cayman Islands, where he had been moving money for the past year. Sophia Brennan had served her purpose, but she was becoming a liability. After hanging up, Richard immediately called his lawyer. Harold, I need you to prepare some documents. Quickly and quietly. Harold Westbrook had been covering Richard's legal tracks for 15 years. Ever since the first time Richard had been caught forging Catherine's signature on business loans. What kind of documents? The kind that transfer ownership of certain properties and accounts into my name only. And Harold, I need them backdated to look like Catherine signed them voluntarily 6 months ago. Richard, that's what I pay you extremely well to make legal. Richard finished. How quickly can you have them ready? If we're talking about what I think we're talking about, I'll need at least 48 hours to make them look legitimate. You have 24? Richard ended the call and immediately opened his laptop to check the balance in his Cayman Islands account. $12 million. Built up through years of skimming from joint investments and business deals Catherine thought they owned together. His phone rang again. Detective Rebecca Park. Mr. Morrison, I'm calling to follow up on your wife's accident. I'd like to schedule a time to speak with you about what happened. Of course, Detective. I'll do anything I can to help. This has been such a shock. I'm sure it has. Can you tell me why Miss Brennan was at your house this afternoon? Richard had prepared for this question. Sophia has been trying to make amends with Catherine about our relationship. Catherine is a very forgiving woman, and she agreed to meet with Sophia to clear the air before the baby comes. And you were comfortable with your wife meeting alone with your girlfriend. The pause before girlfriend told Richard that Detective Park had already done her homework. Former girlfriend, Richard corrected. Sophia and I ended our relationship weeks ago when Catherine and I decided to focus on our marriage and our coming child. Sophia was having trouble accepting that decision, which is why Catherine agreed to speak with her directly. I see. And where were you when the accident occurred? In my office. I have security footage and witnesses who can confirm that. We'll need copies of that footage. Of course, I'll have my assistant send everything over. After Detective Park hung up, Richard called his head of security. Marcus, I need you to edit the lobby security footage from this afternoon. Remove any timestamps that show when I left the building. Sir, that's what I pay you to do without asking questions, Richard said. And Marcus, have you ever been to the Cayman Islands? I hear it's beautiful this time of year. The message was clear: loyalty would be rewarded, but disloyalty would be expensive. As the sun set over Denver, Richard Morrison felt the familiar thrill of a complex plan coming together. He had built his fortune by staying 3 steps ahead of his competitors, and this situation would be no different. Catherine might think she was ready to fight, but she had no idea what she was up against. His millionaire husband status came with resources she couldn't imagine and connections she didn't know existed. By the time this was over, Catherine would be lucky to get visiting rights to see their child. Sophia would be serving time for assault, and Richard would be starting fresh in a country with no extradition treaty. It was almost perfect. The only variable he hadn't accounted for was the possibility that Catherine Morrison might finally be done underestimating herself. The next morning, Catherine woke in her hospital bed to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the bedside table. Still groggy from pain medication. She glanced at the caller ID and felt her stomach drop. Richard. Catherine. Thank God you're awake. His voice was honey-sweet with concern. How are you feeling? I wanted to stay at the hospital last night, but I thought you needed rest. Where were you yesterday? Richard, Catherine asked, her voice hoarse but steady. When Sophia was in our house. I told you, darling, I was at the office. I have the security footage to prove it. Catherine, I'm worried about you. The doctor said head injuries can cause confusion, memory problems. Maybe you're not remembering things clearly. There it was again, the gentle gaslighting, the suggestion that her own mind couldn't be trusted. For 20 years, Catherine had accepted Richard's version of reality over her own instincts. Not anymore. My memory is perfectly clear, she said. Sophia admitted everything. The forged documents, the offshore accounts, the plan to get rid of the baby. Catherine, please. You're starting to sound paranoid. Sophia brought you flowers as a peace offering, and you had an accident. Why would you want to turn this into something sinister? Because it was sinister, Catherine thought, but she didn't say it aloud. Instead, she said, I need to go. Richard, the doctor wants to run more tests. After hanging up, Catherine immediately called the number Detective Park had left for her. Detective Park, this is Catherine Morrison. I need to tell you about a phone conversation I overheard yesterday. What kind of conversation? Catherine took a deep breath. After Sophia pushed me down the stairs, she called my husband. I heard her say, Catherine fell down the stairs. Yes, I was here visiting, just like you suggested. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough to make Catherine wonder if the call had dropped. Mrs. Morrison, are you saying you believe your husband was involved in planning what happened to you? I'm saying my husband knew Sophia was coming to the house, and he knew why. That's a very serious accusation. It's a very serious crime. Detective, an hour later, Detective Rebecca Park stood in Catherine's hospital room with a digital recorder and a skeptical expression. At 38, Park had investigated enough domestic violence cases to recognize the signs, but she had also learned that wealthy men like Richard Morrison didn't usually leave obvious trails. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to walk me through everything that happened yesterday, from the moment you woke up. Catherine told her story methodically, starting with Richard leaving for work without his usual goodbye kiss, continuing through Sophia's arrival and culmination in the push down the stairs. Did you invite Miss Brennan to your home? Absolutely not. I didn't even know she had a key until she told me Richard gave her one. Detective Park made a note. We'll need to verify that. What exactly did Miss Brennan say about your husband's financial arrangements? Catherine repeated Sophia's claims about the house being transferred into the younger woman's name, about forged signatures and offshore accounts. Do you have access to your joint financial accounts? I should, but I haven't checked them in months. Richard handles all our investments and major financial decisions. Mrs. Morrison, I have to ask, why would a woman who's been having an affair with your husband suddenly come to your house to confess and threaten you? What would she gain from that? It was a good question, and Catherine had been thinking about it all night. I think Sophia believed Richard was going to leave me for her. But then I got pregnant, and suddenly there was another complication. A baby means child support, custody arrangements, ongoing connections. It means Richard could never completely cut ties with me. Detective Park nodded. So she saw the pregnancy as an obstacle to her future with your husband. More than that, I think Richard told her that if something happened to the baby, it would be easier to make me look unstable, unfit, maybe even dangerous to myself. That's a very calculated plan, Mrs. Morrison. My husband is a very calculated man. Detective. After Detective Park left, Catherine's phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. Mrs. Morrison. This is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh & Associates. I'm a divorce attorney, and I understand you might need legal representation. Catherine frowned. I didn't call any attorneys. Your sister Maria contacted me this morning. She's very concerned about your situation and thought you might benefit from some legal advice. I specialize in complex divorce cases involving significant assets and difficult circumstances. What kind of difficult circumstances? The kind where one spouse has been systematically hiding assets while planning to leave the other spouse financially and legally vulnerable? Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. How quickly can you meet? I can be at the hospital in 30 minutes. Jennifer Walsh turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-50s with steel gray hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from winning battles against powerful men. She carried a briefcase that looked like it had survived several wars and wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. Mrs. Morrison, your sister gave me some background on your situation. Before we discuss anything else, I need to tell you that what you're describing sounds like a pattern of financial abuse combined with an escalation to physical violence. These cases require very careful handling. What do you mean? I mean that men like your husband don't usually get caught the first time they try to eliminate an inconvenient wife. They've been planning for years, moving money, creating paper trails that make their wives look incompetent or unstable. Jennifer opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. I took the liberty of running some preliminary checks on your husband's business interests. Mrs. Morrison, when was the last time you actually saw copies of your joint tax returns? Catherine thought about it. Richard always handles the taxes. He says they're too complicated for me to understand. I see. And when was the last time you personally spoke to your financial advisor about your investment portfolio? Richard manages all of that. He says it's more efficient to have one point of contact. Jennifer's expression grew grim. Mrs. Morrison, based on public records, your husband has been transferring assets out of joint accounts for at least 2 years. Properties you probably think you own have been moved into business entities where you're not listed as a beneficiary. Catherine felt the room spinning. That's impossible. He would need my signature. He would need a signature that looks like yours, Jennifer corrected. Document forgery is surprisingly common in cases like this. But why, if Richard wanted a divorce, he could have just asked? I would have been reasonable about the financial settlement. Jennifer's smile was sympathetic but sad. Mrs. Morrison, reasonable isn't good enough for men like your husband. They wanted all: the wife, the mistress, the money, the reputation, and no consequences for their choices. So what do? We document everything. We freeze what accounts we can. We build a case that shows the pattern of financial abuse and connects it to what happened yesterday. Jennifer leaned forward. But I have to warn you, this is going to get ugly. Your husband has had years to prepare for this moment. We're starting from behind. Catherine thought about Richard's confident voice on the phone that morning, his casual dismissal of her accusations, his certainty that he could control the narrative. Ms. Walsh, my husband thinks I'm too weak to fight him. He thinks 20 years of marriage has broken me down into someone who'll just accept whatever story he tells. And has it? Catherine looked down at her hands, which were no longer shaking. Yesterday, it might have, but today, I have a daughter to protect. Daughter. The ultrasound this morning, we're having a girl. Catherine's voice grew stronger. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let her grow up thinking that powerful men can just erase inconvenient women. Jennifer smiled for the first time since entering the room. Mrs. Morrison, I think we're going to get along just fine. As her new attorney began explaining the legal strategy they would need to pursue, Catherine realized that the investigation into her fall was just the beginning. The real battle would be proving that Richard Morrison had spent 20 years systematically destroying his wife's independence so that when the time came to eliminate her, she would be too isolated and powerless to fight back. But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He had underestimated what a woman could accomplish when she finally stopped trying to save a marriage and started fighting to save herself. 2 days later, Catherine was released from the hospital with strict instructions to rest and a prescription for prenatal vitamins that felt like a small miracle. As Maria helped her into the passenger seat of her car, Catherine noticed a black sedan following them from the hospital parking lot. Maria, don't look back, but I think we're being followed. Her sister glanced in the rearview mirror and swore under her breath. Private investigator. Probably. Richard's already building his defense. They drove to Maria's house instead of the Morrison mansion, taking a circuitous route through downtown Denver that confirmed their suspicions about the tale. Maria lived in a modest neighborhood that felt like a fortress of normalcy after the cold luxury Catherine had grown accustomed to. You can stay here as long as you need, Maria said, carrying Catherine's hastily packed bag into the guest room. But Kat, we need to talk about what comes next. Jennifer Walsh is filing for a restraining order this afternoon, Catherine said, lowering herself carefully onto the bed. And she's trying to freeze our joint accounts before Richard can move more money. That's not what I mean. Maria sat beside her sister, her expression serious. I mean, we need to talk about what happens if the police can't prove what Sophia did. What happens if Richard's money and connections make this whole thing disappear? Catherine had been trying not to think about that possibility, but Maria was right to force the conversation. Jennifer says that even if the criminal case doesn't stick, we can use the civil courts, lower burden of proof, and Richard's money becomes evidence of his ability to damage me, rather than protection from consequences. And if that doesn't work, Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then I disappear. I take my daughter, and I start over somewhere Richard can't find us. Maria nodded grimly. I'd been researching what that would take. New identities, cash reserves, places to live off the grid. It's possible, but it's not easy. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Walsh. Need you to see something. Can you meet me at my office in an hour? An hour later, Catherine sat in Jennifer's law office staring at a stack of documents that made her feel sick. These are copies of loan applications filed in your name over the past 3 years, Jennifer explained, totaling nearly $8 million in borrowed money against properties you thought you owned jointly with Richard. Catherine picked up one of the documents and stared at her own signature, or what looked like her signature. I never signed these. I know, but they're very good forgeries. Good enough to fool bank officials who were probably getting substantial fees for processing these loans quickly and quietly. Jennifer spread out more papers. Here's where it gets interesting. All of this borrowed money was immediately transferred to accounts in the Cayman Islands, accounts that were opened 6 months ago in Richard's name only. He's been planning to leave me for 6 months. Longer than that. Mrs. Morrison, your husband has been systematically looting your marriage for years. He's been using your credit rating, your signature, and your ownership stake in properties to generate cash that he's been hiding offshore. Catherine felt nauseous. How much? So far, we can trace about $15 million, but there's probably more. 15 million, Catherine's voice cracked. I thought we were building a life together. I thought the business success, the real estate investments, the lifestyle, I thought we were partners. You were partners, Jennifer said gently. You were just the only one who didn't know the partnership was designed to end with your elimination. Catherine's phone rang. Detective Park. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to come to the station. We've had some developments in your case. 30 minutes later, Catherine sat in an interview room at the Denver Police Department watching Detective Park set up a digital recorder with careful precision. Mrs. Morrison, we've completed our initial interviews with your husband and Ms. Brennan. I'd like to play you some excerpts and get your response. The first recording was Richard's voice, smooth and confident. Detective, my wife has been under tremendous stress with this pregnancy. She's 47 years old, which is considered high risk, and I think the hormonal changes have been affecting her judgment. Catherine has always been prone to dramatic interpretations of normal events. Catherine felt her cheeks burn. Even in a police interview, Richard was painting her as an unstable woman whose word couldn't be trusted. The second recording was Sophia, and her performance was Oscar-worthy. I feel so guilty about what happened. I just wanted to make peace with Catherine before the baby came. Richard ended our relationship weeks ago, and I thought maybe Catherine and I could find a way to be civil for the sake of the family. When she fell, I tried to catch her, but she was too far away. I keep thinking about what I could have done differently. That's not what happened, Catherine said firmly. I know, Detective Park replied, which is why I want you to hear this. The third recording was a phone conversation, and Catherine immediately recognized both voices, Richard and Sophia, but not from their police interviews. Richard's voice: "The problem takes care of itself if she loses the baby. Then it's just her word against ours. And who's going to believe a woman who's already had one suspicious accident?" Sophia's voice: "What if she doesn't lose the baby? What if she survives and remembers what I said?" Richard: "She won't remember anything useful. Catherine's been trained for 20 years to doubt her own perceptions. By the time we're done, even she'll believe she fell by herself." Catherine's hands began to shake. "How did you get this? Ms. Brennan recorded several conversations with your husband over the past month. She gave us the recordings yesterday." "Why would she do that?" Detective Park's smile was grim. "Because she realized that your husband was setting her up to take the fall for attempted murder while he walked away clean. Ms. Brennan may be many things, but she's not stupid." Catherine felt a surge of something that might have been gratitude toward the woman who had tried to kill her. At least Sophia had finally seen Richard Morrison for what he really was. "What happens now?" "Now we arrest your husband for conspiracy to commit assault with a deadly weapon, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The district attorney's office is also looking into the financial crimes your attorney has uncovered." And Sophia: "Ms. Brennan is cooperating fully with our investigation in exchange for reduced charges. She'll serve time, but probably not more than 3 to 5 years." Catherine leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of 20 years of manipulation lifting from her shoulders. For the first time since her fall, she allowed herself to hope that justice might actually be possible. "Detective, there's something else you should know. My attorney discovered that Richard has been forging my signature on loan documents for years. He's stolen millions of dollars from our joint assets. We'll add that to the charges. Mrs. Morrison, I have to ask, do you have somewhere safe to stay? Men like your husband don't usually go quietly when their plans fall apart." Catherine thought about Richard's reaction when he was arrested, about the network of corrupt officials and business associates who owed him favors, about the $15 million in offshore accounts that could buy a lot of cooperation. "I have somewhere to go," she said. "But detective, how long do you think it will take to actually convict him? In a case this complex with this much money involved, probably 2 to 3 years if he fights it aggressively. 2 to 3 years of legal battles, of watching Richard use his wealth and influence to drag out the process, of wondering if he might find a way to eliminate the inconvenient witness who could send him to prison." As Catherine left the police station, she realized that getting Richard arrested was just the first step. Keeping him in prison long enough to pay for his crimes would be an entirely different battle. But for the first time in 20 years, Catherine Morrison felt like she was fighting with the truth on her side instead of against it. Her millionaire husband had finally pushed too far, and the woman he had spent 2 decades breaking down was about to show him what she was capable of when she stopped trying to save their marriage and started fighting to save her life. 6 weeks later, Catherine sat in the front row of courtroom 4B in the Denver County Courthouse, her hands resting protectively over her now obviously pregnant belly. The morning sickness had finally subsided, replaced by the strange energy that comes with the second trimester and the fierce determination to protect her unborn daughter. Richard Morrison entered the courtroom flanked by 2 expensive attorneys, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and looked every inch the successful businessman rather than the accused felon he had become. Their eyes met across the courtroom, and Catherine saw something she had never seen before in her husband's face: genuine uncertainty. The man who had controlled every aspect of their marriage for 20 years was finally in a situation where his money and influence might not be enough to guarantee the outcome he wanted. Judge Patricia Hayes, a stern woman in her early 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense courtrooms, called the session to order. The State of Colorado versus Richard Morrison and Sophia Brennan, case number 2025 CR 4891. We're here today for the preliminary hearing on charges of conspiracy to commit assault, fraud, and attempted murder. Catherine felt a chill hearing the charges read aloud. Attempted murder. Someone had actually tried to kill her and her baby, and now she was sitting in a courtroom hoping that the justice system would hold them accountable. The prosecutor, David Kim, was a 41-year-old career criminal attorney with an impressive conviction rate and a personal history that included growing up in an abusive household. Jennifer Walsh had specifically requested him for Catherine's case. Your Honor, Kim began, the evidence will show that Richard Morrison and Sophia Brennan engaged in a deliberate conspiracy to cause the death of Mrs. Catherine Morrison and her unborn child. This was not a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated plan to commit murder for financial gain. Richard's lead attorney, Charles Whitfield, was a silver-haired man in his 60s who charged $800 an hour and had made his reputation defending wealthy clients against inconvenient wives. Your Honor, the prosecution's case is built on the desperate fantasies of a woman whose pregnancy hormones have affected her judgment and the self-serving lies of Ms. Brennan, who is trying to reduce her own sentence by implicating my client in her reckless actions. The same old story, Catherine thought. The hysterical woman whose hormones made her unreliable, whose word couldn't be trusted against a successful man's reputation. But this time, they had recordings. Prosecutor Kim played the first tape, and Richard's voice filled the courtroom. The problem takes care of itself if she loses the baby. Then it's just her word against ours. Catherine watched the jury's faces as they heard her husband casually discussing the death of his wife and child as a problem that needed to be solved. Several jurors looked physically disgusted. The second recording was even more damning. Catherine's been trained for 20 years to doubt her own perceptions. By the time we're done, even she'll believe she fell by herself. Judge Hayes's expression grew increasingly stern as the recordings played. When the audio finished, she looked directly at Richard Morrison. Mr. Morrison, do you recognize the voice on these recordings? Charles Whitfield stood quickly. Your Honor, my client will not be responding to questions at this time. The court will note that the defendant declined to confirm or deny whether that was his voice on the recordings, Judge Hayes said dryly. The prosecution called their first witness Carlos Mendez, the building maintenance worker who had been cleaning windows in the Morrison Mansion's foyer on the day of Catherine's fall. Carlos was a nervous man in his 30s who spoke with a slight accent and kept glancing at Richard as if expecting retaliation. Mr. Mendez, please tell the court what you saw on the afternoon in question. I was cleaning the big windows in the front hall when I heard voices upstairs. Two ladies talking, but not friendly talking, angry talking. Could you hear what they were saying? Some of it. The young lady, she was saying something about a baby being a problem. The older lady, Mrs. Morrison, she was telling her to leave. What happened next? Carlos took a shaky breath. I heard footsteps, like someone walking fast. Then I heard Mrs. Morrison scream, and she came tumbling down the stairs. The young lady, she was at the top looking down. Did the young lady appear surprised by Mrs. Morrison's fall? No, sir. She looked satisfied, like something had gone the way she wanted. Charles Whitfield's cross-examination was aggressive. Mr. Mendez, how much money did Mrs. Morrison's attorney offer you to testify today? Nobody offered me money. But you were paid money to forget what you saw, weren't you? Carlos's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Mr. Morrison gave me $5,000 to say I didn't see nothing. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Catherine felt a surge of gratitude toward Carlos, who was risking his job and possibly his safety to tell the truth. And why are you changing your story now? Whitfield pressed. Carlos looked directly at Catherine, his eyes sad but determined. Because I got daughters, sir, and I can't sleep at night knowing I took money to help a man hurt a pregnant lady. The next witness was Dr. Sarah Chen, Catherine's obstetrician, who testified about the specific nature of Catherine's injuries. The pattern of bruising and the location of the impact injuries are consistent with a fall that resulted from being pushed backward rather than losing balance naturally, Dr. Chen explained. When someone trips or loses their balance, they typically fall forward or to the side. Mrs. Morrison's injuries suggest she was propelled backward with significant force. But the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source, Richard's business partner of 15 years, Michael Torres. Mr. Torres, how long have you known the defendant? Richard and I started Morrison Development together in 2010. We've been partners for 15 years. During that time, did Mr. Morrison ever discuss his marriage with you? Michael Torres was a heavy-set man in his 50s who looked deeply uncomfortable being in court. Richard talked about Catherine sometimes, but not in nice ways. Can you be more specific? He called her his retirement plan, said that once he'd built up enough assets in her name, he could get rid of her and start fresh with someone younger. Catherine felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Retirement plan. 20 years of her life reduced to a financial strategy. Did Mr. Morrison ever discuss how he planned to get rid of his wife? Torres looked miserable. He said accidents happen to inconvenient people all the time. Said the key was making sure you weren't anywhere near when they happened. Charles Whitfield's objection was sustained, but the damage was done. The jury had heard Richard Morrison's own business partner describe him as a man who viewed his wife's death as a business opportunity. As the day's testimony concluded, Catherine realized that her husband's greatest weakness had always been his arrogance. He had been so confident in his ability to control and manipulate that he had never bothered to hide his true nature from the people around him. Now those people were testifying against him, and his 25-year career of using and discarding people was finally catching up with him. As Catherine left the courthouse with Maria and Jennifer Walsh, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the certainty that her voice was being heard, her truth was being believed, and her life finally belonged to her. The woman Richard Morrison had spent 20 years training to doubt herself was about to show him the price of underestimating someone who had finally learned to trust her own strength. The second day of Richard Morrison's preliminary hearing began with the testimony that Catherine had been dreading, the forensic accountant who would detail the full scope of her husband's financial betrayal. Margaret Chen, a precise woman in her 40s who specialized in tracking hidden assets in complex divorce cases, took the witness stand carrying 3 thick binders of documents. Ms. Chen, please tell the court your findings regarding the Morrison family's financial arrangements. Margaret Chen's voice was crisp and professional as she detailed 20 years of systematic theft. Over the course of my investigation, I discovered that Mr. Morrison has diverted approximately $18 million from joint marital assets into accounts solely under his control. Catherine felt the courtroom spinning. $18 million, more than she had ever imagined. This diversion was accomplished through several methods, Chen continued. Forged signatures on loan documents, unauthorized transfers from joint investment accounts, and the creation of shell companies where Mrs. Morrison was listed as an owner but had no actual access or control. Prosecutor Kim introduced dozens of documents as evidence, each one showing Catherine's forged signature, authorizing transactions she had never known existed. Ms. Chen, in your professional opinion, how long would this level of financial deception have taken to execute based on the complexity and the paper trail? I would estimate that Mr. Morrison began systematically moving assets out of his wife's reach approximately 5 years ago. However, the most aggressive transfers occurred within the past 18 months. What changed 18 months ago? That corresponds to when Mrs. Morrison first consulted a fertility specialist. It appears that once pregnancy became a possibility, Mr. Morrison accelerated his efforts to isolate her financially. Catherine closed her eyes, remembering the joy she had felt when they first started trying to conceive. While she had been dreaming of nurseries and baby names, Richard had been planning her financial destruction. Richard's attorney, Charles Whitfield, attempted to portray the transfers as legitimate business decisions. Ms. Chen, Isn't it common for successful businessmen to diversify their holdings and protect assets from potential lawsuits? Yes, but legitimate asset protection doesn't typically involve forging a spouse's signature or hiding the transfers from that spouse. How can you be certain the signatures were forged? Chen pulled out a thick folder. I had Mrs. Morrison's signature analyzed by 3 independent handwriting experts. All 3 concluded that the signatures on these financial documents were created by someone other than Mrs. Morrison. The prosecution's next witness was even more damaging, Harold Westbrook, Richard's lawyer of 15 years, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. Harold was a nervous man in his 60s who had clearly never expected to find himself testifying against a client. His voice shook as he described years of helping Richard create fraudulent documents. Mr. Westbrook, did Mr. Morrison ever ask you to prepare documents that required Mrs. Morrison's signature without her knowledge? Yes, multiple times over the past 5 years. And did you know these signatures were forged? Harold looked everywhere except at Richard. Richard told me Catherine had signed them at home and asked him to bring them to my office. I chose to believe him. But you suspected otherwise. The signatures were always perfect. Too perfect. When people sign documents at home, there are usually small variations. Coffee stains, slight wrinkles in the paper. These documents looked like they had been signed in a controlled environment by someone who was being very careful to replicate a signature exactly. Did you ever express these concerns to Mr. Morrison? Once, I asked him if Catherine might prefer to come to my office to sign important documents herself. He told me that Catherine suffered from anxiety about legal matters and that it was kinder to handle things without involving her directly. Catherine felt sick. Even Richard's explanations for his crimes painted her as weak and incapable. Mr. Westbrook, did there come a time when Mr. Morrison asked you to prepare documents that would transfer ownership of the family home into his name only? Yes. The day after Mrs. Morrison's fall, a collective gasp went up from the courtroom gallery. Richard had moved to steal Catherine's home while she was still in the hospital recovering from his girlfriend's attempt to murder her. What was your response to this request? Harold's voice was barely audible. I told him it would look suspicious given the timing. He said timing didn't matter because Catherine would either be too traumatized to fight or too dead to object. Charles Whitfield shot to his feet. Objection hearsay and prejudicial. I'll allow it, Judge Hayes said coldly. The witness is testifying about statements made directly to him by the defendant. The most damaging testimony came from Richard's banker, Patricia Valdez, who had processed many of the fraudulent transactions. Miss Valdez, did you ever have direct contact with Mrs. Morrison regarding these large financial transfers? No. Mr. Morrison always handled everything himself. He said his wife preferred not to be involved in financial details. Did this seem unusual to you? Patricia shifted uncomfortably. For transfers of this magnitude, we usually require both spouses to appear in person. But Mr. Morrison was a very valuable client, and he assured us that everything was properly authorized. Did he ever show you Mrs. Morrison's identification or any other verification that she had actually signed these documents? No. He said she had signed them at home and that requiring her to come to the bank would be an unnecessary inconvenience. The prosecution played recorded phone calls between Richard and various financial institutions, all using the same story: Catherine was too busy, too anxious, or too delicate to handle financial matters personally. My wife is having a difficult pregnancy, Richard's voice said on one recording. She's asked me to handle all business matters until after the baby's born. Catherine realized that Richard had been using her pregnancy, the thing she thought had brought them closer together, as an excuse to steal everything she owned. The final witness of the day was Detective Rebecca Park, who testified about Richard's attempts to obstruct the investigation. Did the defendant cooperate with your investigation? Initially, yes, but when we requested certain financial records, Mr. Morrison's attorneys filed numerous motions to block our access. They claimed the records were protected by attorney-client privilege, even though most of them were banking documents. Were you eventually able to obtain these records? Yes, through court order. And we discovered that several documents had been altered or destroyed between the time we first requested them and when we received them. What kind of alterations? Computer records showing the dates when transfers were authorized had been changed. Email correspondence between Mr. Morrison and his associates had been deleted, and several hard copy documents had been shredded. As Detective Park's testimony concluded, Catherine looked across the courtroom at Richard, who was whispering urgently with his attorneys. For the first time since she had known him, Richard Morrison looked like a man who was losing control. His carefully constructed empire of lies was crumbling, and all the money and influence in the world couldn't change the fact that he had left a trail of evidence documenting 20 years of fraud and abuse. As court adjourned for the day, Jennifer Walsh squeezed Catherine's hand. "How are you holding up? I keep thinking about all the times I asked Richard about our finances and he told me not to worry about it." Catherine said, "All the times I signed papers without reading them because I trusted him. I feel so stupid." "You weren't stupid," Jennifer said firmly. "You were systematically isolated and manipulated by someone who spent decades perfecting his technique. The fact that you're sitting here fighting back proves you're stronger than he ever gave you credit for." As Catherine left the courthouse, she realized that exposing Richard's financial crimes was about more than recovering stolen money. It was about proving that she had never been the helpless, incompetent woman he had trained everyone to see. Tomorrow, the prosecution would present evidence about the conspiracy to commit murder, but today had established something equally important. Catherine Morrison was not a victim who could be easily dismissed. She was a woman who had survived 20 years of financial abuse and was now ready to take back everything that had been stolen from her. The third day of Richard Morrison's preliminary hearing began with an unexpected disruption. As Catherine took her seat in the front row, she noticed a woman in her late 50s sitting in the back of the courtroom, staring intently at Richard. The woman looked familiar, but Catherine couldn't place her. Judge Hayes had barely called the court to order when the woman stood up. "Your Honor, I need to speak." Charles Whitfield immediately objected. "This person is not on any witness list." "Your Honor," Prosecutor Kim said, looking as surprised as everyone else. "We need a moment to confer." Judge Hayes called a 15-minute recess, during which Catherine watched Kim speak intensely with the unknown woman. When court reconvened, Kim addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call Patricia Morrison as a witness." Catherine's blood went cold. Patricia Morrison, Richard's first wife, the woman he claimed had died in a car accident 15 years ago. Richard shot to his feet. "That's impossible. Patricia is dead." "Mr. Morrison, sit down," Judge Hayes ordered sharply. "Miss Morrison, please approach the bench." As the woman walked forward, Catherine could see the family resemblance, the same dark hair, the same sharp cheekbones, the same way of holding her shoulders that she had noticed in old photographs Richard kept hidden in his desk drawer. Patricia Morrison took the witness stand with shaking hands but a determined expression. "Ms. Morrison, please state your relationship to the defendant." "Richard Morrison was my husband from 1998 to 2010. We divorced after 12 years of marriage." "Ms. Morrison, are you aware that the defendant has been telling people you were deceased?" Patricia's laugh was bitter. "I'm not surprised. Richard always said I was dead to him after I left." "Why did you leave your marriage?" Patricia took a shaky breath. "Because Richard Morrison tried to kill me." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Hayes banged her gavel for order. "Ms. Morrison, please tell the court what happened." "I was 6 months pregnant with Richard's child. We had been trying to have a baby for years, and I thought he was happy about the pregnancy. But I started noticing that he was moving money around, talking to lawyers, acting like he was preparing for something." Catherine felt her heart pounding. The story was horribly familiar. "One evening, Richard and I had an argument about some documents he wanted me to sign, financial papers that would have given him control of my inheritance from my parents. When I refused to sign them, He became furious. What happened next? He pushed me down a flight of stairs in our house. I fell from the second floor to the first floor landing, and I lost the baby. Catherine gasped audibly. The parallel was perfect right down to the pregnancy, the financial documents, and the push down the stairs. What did you do after this incident? I was hospitalized for a week with a broken collarbone and internal injuries. When I got out, Richard had already told everyone that I had fallen by accident due to pregnancy clumsiness, but I knew it wasn't an accident. Did you report this to the police? Patricia's voice grew bitter. I tried, but Richard had witnesses who said they saw me trip. He had security footage that had been edited to make it look like I lost my balance. And he had me painted as an unstable woman whose pregnancy hormones were making her paranoid. Catherine felt sick with recognition. The same playbook, used 25 years apart. So what did you do? I ran. I took what money I could access, changed my name, and disappeared. I've been living in Oregon for the past 15 years under the name Patricia Chen. Why didn't you pursue criminal charges or a divorce settlement? Because Richard told me that if I ever came forward, he would have me killed and make it look like suicide. He said he had connections who could make inconvenient people disappear permanently. Patricia looked directly at Richard for the first time since taking the stand. He said the only reason he was letting me live was because I was already legally dead to him, and dead people can't testify in court. Charles Whitfield's cross-examination was brutal. Ms. Morrison, or should I say Ms. Chen, you disappeared for 15 years, never contacted your family, never attempted to claim any marital assets, and now you're conveniently appearing just when my client faces serious charges. Isn't it possible you're seeking revenge for an unhappy marriage? I'm seeking justice for attempted murder, Patricia replied steadily. And I'm trying to prevent Richard from doing to Catherine what he did to me. You claim my client pushed you downstairs, but you have no evidence of this alleged incident. Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. Actually, I do. The courtroom fell silent as Patricia activated the device. Richard's voice, 25 years younger, but unmistakably his, filled the room. You stupid bitch. You think you can defy me? You think your daddy's money makes you independent? I'll show you what happens to wives who don't know their place. The recording continued with sounds of a struggle, Patricia's scream, and then Richard's voice again. Oops! Looks like the pregnant lady had an accident. Good thing I wasn't here to see it. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. Richard had been planning and executing the murder of inconvenient wives for decades. Ms. Morrison, why did you keep this recording for 25 years? Because I knew someday he would try to kill another woman, and when he did, I wanted to make sure there was evidence to stop him. Judge Hayes called a recess, during which Catherine sat in stunned silence. Jennifer Walsh put a comforting hand on her shoulder. Catherine, this changes everything. With Patricia's testimony, we can show a pattern of behavior spanning decades. Richard can't claim this was a momentary lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding. When court reconvened, Prosecutor Kim called one final witness, Sophia Brennan. Sophia looked like she had aged years in the weeks since Catherine's fall. Her confidence was gone, replaced by the hollow expression of someone who had finally realized the full extent of what she had been part of. Miss Brennan, please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant. Richard and I had been having an affair for 8 months. He told me he was unhappy in his marriage and wanted to be with me, but his wife was holding him back financially. Did Mr. Morrison ever discuss what would happen to his wife? Sophia's voice was barely audible. He said Catherine was a problem that needed to be solved permanently. He said if she had an accident during her pregnancy, he would inherit everything and we could start fresh together. Did Mr. Morrison suggest how this accident might occur? He said pregnant women fall downstairs all the time. He said it would be tragic but not suspicious, especially if Catherine had a history of being clumsy or unstable. Did you agree to cause such an accident? Sophia broke down completely. He told me it was the only way we could be together. He said Catherine would never let him go otherwise, and that she was using the pregnancy to trap him financially. Ms. Brennan, do you understand that you were manipulated into attempting murder? I understand that Richard Morrison is a monster who convinced me to become one too. As Sophia's testimony concluded, Catherine looked across the courtroom at Richard one final time. His face was gray, his confident posture collapsed. For the first time in their 20-year marriage, Richard Morrison looked like what he truly was, a predator who had finally been cornered by his own victims. Judge Hayes banged her gavel. Based on the evidence presented, I am binding over both defendants for trial on all charges. Mr. Morrison, you are remanded to custody without bail as a flight risk and a danger to witnesses. As sheriff's deputies placed handcuffs on Richard Morrison, Catherine felt 20 years of fear and self-doubt lifting from her shoulders. The man who had spent decades convincing her that she was weak, stupid, and worthless was being led away in chains. The woman he had tried to destroy was still standing, and she was just getting started. 4 months later, Catherine Morrison sat in the same courtroom, her 8-month pregnant belly making the wooden bench uncomfortable, but her spirit stronger than it had ever been. The trial of Richard Morrison and Sophia Brennan had captivated Denver's media for weeks, with headlines calling it the Millionaire murder plot and the staircase conspiracy. Catherine had testified for 3 days, telling her story with a clear voice and unshakable resolve. She had looked Richard in the eyes as she described 20 years of manipulation, financial abuse, and finally the attempted murder that had opened her eyes to the truth about the man she had married. Richard's defense team had tried everything, claiming Catherine was mentally unstable due to pregnancy hormones, suggesting she had fallen accidentally and constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory to explain her injuries, even arguing that Sophia had acted alone without Richard's knowledge or involvement. But Patricia Morrison's testimony had destroyed their case. The jury heard 2 women, 25 years apart, describing identical patterns of abuse, identical methods of financial theft, and identical attempts at murder. The recordings Patricia had preserved proved that Richard Morrison was not a man who had made one terrible mistake, but a calculating predator who had been perfecting his technique for decades. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. The $18 million in hidden assets, the forged signatures, the deleted computer records, the edited security footage, all of it painted a picture of a man who had been systematically planning his wife's elimination for years. Sophia Brennan had pled guilty to attempted murder in the 2nd degree in exchange for her testimony against Richard. She would serve 8 to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 6 years if she continued to cooperate with prosecutors. But Richard Morrison faced life in prison. The jury had been deliberating for 3 days, and Catherine could see the strain on Richard's face growing with each passing hour. His expensive attorneys whispered urgently in his ear, but they all knew that no amount of legal maneuvering could overcome the mountain of evidence against him. Jennifer Walsh sat beside Catherine, along with Maria and Patricia Morrison, who had become an unexpected source of strength and support. The 4 women had formed a bond forged by survival and the determination to see justice done. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" Judge Hayes asked. The jury foreman, a retired teacher in her 60s, stood with a solemn expression. "Yes, Your Honor, we have. In the matter of the state of Colorado versus Richard Morrison, on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the 1st degree, how do you find we find the defendant guilty?" Catherine felt Maria squeeze her hand as the courtroom erupted in quiet celebration behind them. "On the charge of attempted murder in the 1st degree, guilty. On the charge of financial fraud in the 1st degree, guilty. On the charge of forgery, guilty." Judge Hayes read through 18 separate charges, and the jury found Richard Morrison guilty on every single count. Catherine watched her millionaire husband's face crumble as the reality of his situation finally sank in. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. 3 weeks later, Catherine sat in the same courtroom for Richard's sentencing hearing. She had been invited to give a victim impact statement, and she had spent days preparing her words. "Your Honor," Catherine began, her voice clear and strong, 20 years ago, I married a man I thought loved me, I believed his promises to protect me, to build a life with me, to be my partner in every sense of the word. She looked directly at Richard, who sat at the defendant's table with his head down. Instead, I married a man who spent 2 decades systematically destroying my independence, my confidence, and my ability to trust my own perceptions. He stole my money, forged my signature, and finally, when I became inconvenient to his plans, he arranged for his girlfriend to murder me and our unborn child. Catherine's hand moved to her belly, where her daughter was due to arrive in just 3 weeks. But Richard Morrison made one crucial mistake. He underestimated what a woman can accomplish when she finally stops trying to save a marriage and starts fighting to save her life. She turned to address the judge directly. Your Honor, I stand before you today not as a victim, but as a survivor. I survived 20 years of psychological abuse, attempted murder, and a conspiracy designed to leave my daughter motherless before she was even born. Catherine's voice grew stronger with each word. I ask this court to sentence Richard Morrison to the maximum penalty allowed by law, not out of revenge, but out of justice. No woman should have to endure what I endured. No child should grow up without a mother because a selfish man decided his convenience was worth more than human life. When Catherine finished her statement, Judge Hayes looked at Richard with undisguised disgust. Mr. Morrison, please stand. Sonning. Richard stood slowly, his expensive suit now wrinkled from weeks of incarceration, his confident bearing replaced by the posture of a broken man. In my 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered a case that more clearly demonstrates the calculated evil that some human beings are capable of. You spent decades perfecting a system of abuse designed to isolate and control the women in your life. When that system was threatened by an inconvenient pregnancy, you escalated to attempted murder. Judge Hayes consulted her notes. The evidence shows that you have no capacity for remorse, no respect for human life, and no consideration for anyone except yourself. You are a danger to society and particularly to any woman unfortunate enough to trust you. Catherine held her breath. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in applause. Catherine felt tears of relief streaming down her face as Maria and Patricia Morrison embraced her. On the remaining charges, I sentence you to additional terms totaling 50 years to run concurrently with your life sentence. Judge Hayes looked at Richard one final time. Mr. Morrison, you will spend the rest of your life in prison, and that is exactly what you deserve. As Richard Morrison was led away in shackles, he looked back at Catherine one final time. She met his gaze without flinching, and for the first time in their relationship, Richard Morrison was the one who looked away first. Outside the courthouse, Catherine stood with Jennifer Walsh, Maria, and Patricia Morrison as reporters asked for comments. Mrs. Morrison, how do you feel about the verdict? One reporter asked. Catherine looked at the cameras, thinking about all the women who might be watching, all the women who might be trapped in marriages like hers had been. I feel grateful, she said. Grateful to be alive, grateful for my daughter, and grateful to live in a society where justice is possible, even when it takes time to achieve. She paused in thinking about her words carefully. But mostly, I want other women to know that your voice matters, your truth matters, and your life matters. No matter how powerful your abuser is, no matter how isolated you feel, no matter how many people tell you that you're imagining things, trust yourself. Document everything. Reach out for help, and never ever give up fighting for your right to exist safely in this world. As Catherine walked away from the courthouse, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, she felt a sense of closure she had never expected to experience. The woman who had been pushed down those stairs 6 months ago had been trapped in a web of lies and manipulation that had taken 20 years to construct. The woman walking away from Richard Morrison's sentencing was free. 3 weeks later, Catherine Morrison held her daughter for the first time in the quiet sanctuary of her hospital room. Hope Catherine Morrison, she had chosen to keep her married name as a reminder of her own strength rather than a symbol of her oppression, weighed 7 pounds. 4 ounces, and had her mother's dark hair and determined chin. "Hello, little one," Catherine whispered, stroking her daughter's tiny hand. "We made it through together." Maria sat in the chair beside the hospital bed, tears streaming down her face. "She's perfect, Kat. Absolutely perfect." Jennifer Walsh had stopped by that morning with the final divorce papers and the settlement agreement that would give Catherine control of the Morrison family assets that hadn't been hidden offshore. Between the recovered funds and the civil lawsuit against Richard's estate, Catherine would have enough money to ensure Hope's future was secure. "The house is officially yours," Jennifer had reported. "Along with the legitimate business assets that Richard couldn't hide, you're looking at approximately $4 million in recovered assets, plus the ongoing civil suits against the banks that processed the forged documents." But more important than the money was the knowledge that Hope would grow up knowing her mother was a woman who had fought for justice and won. Dr. Sarah Chen stopped by during visiting hours to check on both mother and baby. "Everything looks perfect," she said, examining Hope with gentle hands. "No lasting effects from the trauma you experienced during pregnancy. She's a strong little girl, just like her mother." Patricia Morrison, who had insisted Catherine call her Aunt Pat, visited that afternoon, bringing a handmade baby blanket and 25 years of wisdom about surviving Richard Morrison. "You know what the most amazing thing about this is?" Patricia asked, holding Hope while Catherine rested. "What's that?" "Richard spent decades convincing women that we were weak, that we needed him to take care of us, that we couldn't survive without his protection and control. But look at us now. You're a millionaire in your own right. I've built a successful life under my own name, and this little girl is going to grow up knowing that women are strong enough to protect themselves and each other." Catherine smiled, thinking about the support network that had formed around her during the trial. Maria, who had taken leave from her job to help Catherine through the legal proceedings. Jennifer Walsh, who had worked pro bono on much of the case because she believed in the importance of stopping financial abusers. Detective Rebecca Park, who had gone above and beyond to ensure every piece of evidence was properly documented. Even Sophia Brennan had written Catherine a letter from prison, apologizing for her role in Richard's scheme and expressing gratitude that Catherine had survived to expose the truth. "Mrs. Morrison," a nurse appeared in the doorway. "There's a reporter from Channel 7 asking if you'd be willing to do an interview about domestic financial abuse. She says she's been following your case and wants to do a story about warning signs that other women should watch for." Catherine looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Tell her yes," Catherine said. "But the interview happens here, with my daughter present. I want other women to see that survival is possible, that you can rebuild your life, and that there is happiness after abuse." 2 days later, Catherine sat in her hospital room, wearing a soft blue dress that accommodated nursing, holding Hope while Channel 7's investigative reporter set up her camera equipment. "Mrs. Morrison, what would you want to say to women who might be in situations similar to what you experienced?" Catherine looked directly into the camera, thinking about her 47-year-old self who had spent so many years accepting Richard's version of reality over her own instincts. "I would tell them that financial abuse is real abuse, even when there are no physical bruises. If your partner controls all the money, if you don't have access to bank account information, if you're not allowed to work or make financial decisions, if you have to ask permission to spend money on basic necessities, those are warning signs." She shifted Hope to a more comfortable position. "But more than that, I would tell them to trust their instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. If you feel isolated, controlled, or afraid, those feelings are valid. And if someone is telling you that your perceptions can't be trusted, that's probably the clearest sign of all that you need to get help." What resources would you recommend for women in these situations? Document everything. Keep copies of financial records somewhere safe, outside your home. Take pictures of important documents with your phone and email them to yourself. Build relationships with people your abuser doesn't control: family members, old friends, support groups. Catherine's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "And remember that leaving an abusive situation is dangerous. but staying is often more dangerous. Get professional help from attorneys who specialize in financial abuse, from domestic violence counselors who understand the psychology of control, and from financial advisors who can help you understand what assets you're entitled to. Looking back, is there anything you wish you had done differently? Catherine considered the question carefully. I wish I had trusted myself sooner. I wish I had asked more questions about our finances, insisted on being included in major decisions, and refused to sign documents I didn't fully understand. But I also understand now that Richard spent 20 years systematically breaking down my confidence and independence. Healing from that kind of manipulation takes time. She looked down at Hope, who was beginning to stir. But I don't regret the path that led me here, because it led me to her. My daughter is going to grow up knowing that women are capable of surviving anything, fighting for justice, and building new lives from the ashes of old ones. What's next for you and Hope? Catherine smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a smile of genuine happiness rather than performance. We're going home, to our house, with our resources and our freedom. I'm going to teach Hope to ski in Aspen and sail on the lake, all the things Richard used to talk about doing with our child. But we're going to do them as free women, not as extensions of someone else's dreams. She paused, thinking about the future she was now free to create. I'm also starting a foundation to help women escape financial abuse. Too many women stay in dangerous situations because they don't have the resources to leave safely. If Hope and I can help change that for even one woman, then everything we went through will have served a purpose. After the interview, Catherine sat alone with Hope, looking out the hospital window at the Denver skyline. The city looked the same as it had 6 months ago, but Catherine's place in it had changed completely. She was no longer Mrs. Richard Morrison, the millionaire's wife who had spent 20 years making herself smaller to fit into someone else's vision of her life. She was Catherine Morrison, a woman who had survived attempted murder, exposed decades of financial fraud, and was now raising her daughter to believe that women's voices matter, women's truths matter, and women's lives matter. The grandfather clock that had chimed ominously in the Morrison mansion foyer was now silent, its sound replaced by the gentle rhythm of Hope's breathing and the quiet confidence of a woman who had finally learned to trust her own strength. As Catherine prepared to take her daughter home, she realized that the most important thing she could teach Hope wasn't about avoiding dangerous men or recognizing warning signs. It was about trusting herself, speaking her truth, and never accepting someone else's definition of her worth. The woman Richard Morrison had tried to erase was gone. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and more determined than he had ever imagined possible. Catherine Morrison had not just survived her millionaire husband's attempt to destroy her, she had transformed into exactly the kind of woman he had always feared she might become, completely, authentically, and powerfully free. As mother and daughter prepared to begin their new life together, Catherine whispered one final promise to the tiny girl in her arms. We're going to write our own story from now on. Hope. And it's going to be a story about women who refuse to disappear, no matter who tries to erase them. The sound of their quiet breathing filled the room, a gentle rhythm of survival, hope, and the unbreakable bond between a mother who had fought for justice and the daughter who would grow up knowing that women's lives are worth fighting for. Their story was just beginning.